Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Ask an Addiction Specialist. It's great to have you with us today. I'm Dr. Bob Weathers, and I've really enjoyed our presentations up to now. We've had a common theme. Next slide, Franz. My co-producers are Franz Salvatierra, Father Franz, and Brother Austin Armstrong. We have a little joke going here in the studio. Our common theme that kind of threads throughout all of our presentations is this idea of plural recovery. If you can bring that slide up. Plural recovery. And the idea of plural recovery is that recovery, as much responsibility as there is for the individual seeking healing from addiction, certainly a tremendous amount of responsibility involved in that task, is that recovery takes most powerfully and in the most sustained way in the context of relationships. And so we're really using as our motto here, helping ourselves help each other. The goal being is that good information, and I'm hoping to present some good information to you again today, can be very useful, not only for the individual seeking recovery, but also for the loved ones in that individual's life, as well as treating professionals. And so our audience is a broad audience. I appreciate very much your being with me and with us again today. Want to encourage you, invite you to submit questions to our co-producers, and they'll bring those questions to me. We'll make sure that we leave time to address any comments or questions that you send in. Always appreciate that. Next slide. Last week our topic was addiction, relationships, and recovery. And we talked about the centrality of relationships, leveraging relationships for the sake of recovery. The technical term for that, next slide, the technical term for that is co-regulation, the idea that we co-regulate one another. But its complementary opposite, I really see these as two sides of the same coin, is self-regulation. And really today's presentation will be focused much more on self-regulation. Not that this can't be shared with one's loved ones, not that it's not useful in therapy or counseling or coaching, but that this is something that the individual who's in recovery can practice themselves. And so next slide. Our topic today, with that in mind, of self-regulation, is mindfulness in recovery. And so we'll be revisiting this topic periodically here in Ask an Addiction Specialist. I know that we have a guest planned in the next month who'll be coming on, Scott Killaby, who has a tremendous background and expertise in mindfulness. And so let today be kind of an entree or a primer in mindfulness, and we'll be reinforcing that in future episodes. Next slide. So let's start with a very basic question. What is mindfulness? There are any number of definitions. I'll tell you who I'm going to be referencing is one of the seminal researchers, next slide, in the area of mindfulness applied to stress management and self-regulation is Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn from Harvard. I've put up here a slide of one of his books, Mindfulness for Beginners. He has a number of books that are available, and you can look at them online. His definition, next slide, Jon Kabat-Zinn's definition starts off very basically, is that mindfulness equals awareness. And so that gets us in the ballpark, and so it also helps demystify it. It's really not all so complex. It's just, what can I do to enhance my awareness? And that would be committing myself to mindfulness practice. But he gets a bit more specific. Next slide. He breaks down awareness into these four constituent parts, and this would be his definition of mindfulness. It's when we pay attention on purpose, focusing in the present moment, and without judgment. So let me talk about each of those elements just briefly, and then we're going to actually engage in a mindfulness exercise today, because I think a picture can tell 1,000 words. In this case, an exercise can. So to pay attention is to focus my mind, focus my attention, and to do that on purpose, to choose to do that. There are times where we're focused just because something's grabbed our attention. Here we're talking about actually corralling and focusing our attention by an act of will, by an act of volition. It's setting aside time where I'm going to be focusing my attention. The focus is in the present moment. You'll certainly see that in our exercise that we move into in just a moment. And so it brings me into the present moment and that I'm doing that on purpose, and then finally I'm doing that without judgment. John Cabot's idea here of non-judgment is that whatever comes into our awareness as we're focusing it in mindfulness exercises, and you'll soon see how this goes, is that there's no reason to evaluate or judge whatever comes to mind, comes to awareness as being positive or negative. It's really training what psychology refers to as the observing ego, the capacity for me to step back from my typical mind, which is active and oftentimes is wandering, and to focus it willfully. And how I succeed or not at that is less critical in terms of evaluating it, because it's like building a muscle. With more practice, we get better at it. I think without any further ado, I'd like to just invite you to join me in a mindfulness exercise. It will take probably 6-7 minutes altogether. And so if you're in a location where there can be relative quiet or relative freedom from distraction, that would be an advantage. It's not impossible to practice mindfulness in any situation. Just early on, it can be helpful it can be facilitative to clear out distractions. So I'm going to invite you to join me. I'll be closing my eyes as I do this, as I recommend for participants when I lead mindfulness exercises in various groups. I'm just coming from a group this afternoon at a local treatment center at Beginnings where we did a mindfulness exercise. In fact, we did the exact same one we're going to do right now. And I invite you to close your eyes unless that feels uncomfortable to you. And there are always some individuals in my groups that don't want to do that, and they have good reasons for not doing that. So find your comfort level. I'll be closing my eyes and inviting you to join me. And we're going to be doing an exercise. Again, it's not mysterious. We're just going to be focusing on mindfulness of the body and the breath. So we're going to start with the breath. So here we go. So if you're sitting in a chair, sit upright. If you're lying down, that's fine too. We're going to do the short exercise, so chances are you won't fall asleep. The way I feel is if you fall asleep, it's not a failed exercise. It just meant that you were too sleepy to be able to focus. So let's see how it goes. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is to take in a deep breath. And when you're ready, release that. Take in another breath when you're ready. And let that go. Now, for the next few breath cycles, I'd like you to see if you can focus on just the sensation of breathing. I recommend locating the rising and falling of your stomach with the in-breath and the out-breath. Some people will focus on the sensation in their nostrils of the breath coming in. But find some anchor for your attention. And let's focus on that for a couple of breath cycles. So breathing in, notice the sensations of that. I'm noticing the tension or the rising of my abdominal area, my stomach. And then when you let go, feel what that feels like. Notice what that feels like. A resting, a settling. And do that again a couple times, a couple of breath cycles, just noticing the sensation as they arise. Breathing in, and breathing out. Now, if you're like most of us human beings, this isn't so straightforward. Oftentimes what comes in are thoughts, memories, worries. So I'd like to do a couple more breath cycles, and this time ask you if thoughts come in, because they oftentimes will, is see what you can do to kind of temporarily set them on a shelf, so to speak, in your mind, and bring your attention gently back to the rising and falling of your breath. Breathing in, thought comes in, set it aside, bring your attention back to the breath, and then let the breath go. In breath, out breath. Okay. On the next breath cycle, as you breathe in, focusing on the breath, when you let that go, let your body fall into gravity, so to speak. And so what I'm suggesting here is let your body go limp if you're sitting in a chair, or if you're lying in bed, let your body feel heavy. Let go into just the heavy natural weight of your body. We're really letting go into gravity. So breathing in. Let your body settle with its full weight as you breathe out. And then repeat that one more time. Breathing in. And as you breathe out, let your body settle. Let gravity have its way. On the next breath cycle, I want you to start at the top of your head and scan down across your body. And what you'll be scanning for is variations in temperature. You'll experience coolness in some parts of your body, relative warmth in other parts, and just notice those differences. So it's asking you to focus quite minutely on distinctions across your body in terms of heat versus cold. Breathing in, start at your head. Breathing out. Continue to scan, another breath cycle. Okay. Let's do another breath cycle, this time returning to the sensations of the breath. Just notice the sensation of breathing in and breathing out. Now the next exercise is a bit more subtle. I'm going to ask you to see if you can locate your heartbeat, the sensation of it in your chest, without putting your hand on your chest. See if you can detect your pulse from your heartbeat, from within your chest, just by paying close attention. Breathing in, breathing out. See if you can detect that. And then just notice it. Another breath cycle, just seeing if you can locate your heartbeat. Good, good. Now, if you weren't able to notice it, I find that in groups that I lead with meditations, about half the members are able to locate it and half not. And honestly, it varies for me. Some days I'm able to experience it, and other days it's hard. So try it this time with your hand on your chest and see if you can notice fully your heartbeat, just holding your chest. Breathing in and breathing out, focusing on the heartbeat. Good, good. Now I want you to drop your attention to your abdominal area and notice how you feel in your stomach. Do you feel hungry? Do you feel full? Are you experiencing indigestion or other discomfort? Do you need to go to the bathroom? Just notice what's going on in your digestive tract right now and focus on that for a breath cycle. Okay, we're almost done, just two more now. On the next one, we're going to scan from head to toe again, except this time we're going to focus on your muscles and your joints. Oftentimes with stress, we can get tight in our shoulders or our neck or chest or our jaws, and this is a chance to notice if there's any tightness or any soreness or achiness. Make note of that, and if you're absent any of that, then just appreciate being relatively pain-free and relaxed in your muscles and your skeletal system. So just scan your body from head to toe on a couple of breath cycles. I'll be silent while we do this. Okay. And then finally, notice what you hear right now. If you're in an undistracted, relatively quiet environment, which is ideal, just appreciate the relative silence. And if you hear sounds, just focus for right now on those sounds as sounds. Just see if you can focus on what you hear without distraction, without thoughts. And if you have a thought arise, see if you can gently set it aside for now and bring your attention back to what you hear. 2 breath cycles on sounds. Footsteps. I'm sitting here with Franz and Austin, and it's pretty doggone quiet. It's unusual for 3 of us to be together and be so quiet. Okay, so when you're ready, we're done, and you can open your eyes. Welcome back. So that's an exercise in mindfulness. There's various forms of mindfulness. This is one of the most basic. I like this one because we take our breaths with us and our bodies with us wherever we go. So you're never without the opportunity to focus on your breath. It can be very useful. But let's talk about why and how it's useful. And we'll reference this experience. Why we did this was to give you a taste of this. Some of you will be practice meditators yourselves, but if you haven't ever done it before, welcome to the world of mindfulness. Next slide. Why do we talk about mindfulness in recovery? What relevance does this exercise that we just engaged in together, how does it relate to my recovery, your recovery? Next slide. I'll be referencing the next few comments from a book by Dr. Stanley Block from the University of Utah. I had a chance to review this book. I actually wrote the foreword to this book and found a lot of value in it. I just want to summarize a few points from Dr. Block's book, The Mind-Body Workbook on Addiction, where, among other things, he focuses on incorporating mindfulness into one's recovery practice. So Dr. Block makes a distinction in this book between, next slide, 2 different brain systems. 2 different brain systems. The first one, next slide. The first brain system is the executive network. We talked about this last week when we talked about the frontal cortex. This is the executive center of our brain in which we make decisions. It's the location of our moral code. It's also instrumental to our relationships, our connection to other individuals. It's very much involved in long-term planning and judgment. It really is the navigator or the executive, the CEO of our lives. But there's a second network, and next slide. This second network actually is what our brains naturally default to, which is to say our brains don't naturally default to the executive mode network. They default to the default mode network. And a way to understand that, next slide, is that our brains have a built-in negativity bias. And you might wonder, well, why would that be the case? Well, for the sake of survival, I'm going to be rewarded a lot more by scanning the horizon for potential threats than I am by being oblivious to them. And so my brain is automatically looking for anything that poses a threat to me. And this gets us close then to what Dr. Block is talking about with the default mode network. It's the central part of the brain. Sometimes it's referred to as the emotional center of the brain. Technically, it's also sometimes called the limbic system. And there's overlap between what we're talking about as the default mode network, our negativity bias, and this limbic system or emotional center. Next slide. We talked about this in our previous presentation, is that stress is the #1 trigger for relapse. Well, let me then tie in Dr. Block's writing about the default mode network, or this negativity bias, is that our brains are on high alert most all of the time. We have a little organ in the middle of our brain called the amygdala, which is referred sometimes as fear central, and it activates in the presence of danger and kicks into our fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And as I said, this serves us in terms of our survival. The problem is it also keeps us, especially if it's chronically turned on, keeps us in a constant bath of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. And so if you can look at the math on this, is that if our natural default mode in our brains is towards this hypervigilance and increased stress, to be kind of ever on the alert, and that stress itself is the number one trigger for my relapse to my addiction, we've got to find some way to go upstream and move from the default mode network into the other brain system, which is the executive system. How do we do that? Next slide. One of the best resources I want to recommend to all of our viewers today is by Dr. Dan Siegel. He's just up the way at UCLA. He has what's referred to as the Mindful Awareness Research Center, affiliated with the medical school at UCLA. And this book right here is an example. The Mindful Brain is an example where he summarizes so much of the research that's been done on the utilization of mindfulness as a means for reducing stress. And that's really what we're talking about here. How can I regulate my stress in such a way that it doesn't take me out and send me back into relapse? There's a few terms that Dr. Siegel discusses in this book that are important. Next slide. One is neuroplasticity. Big word, and it means simply this. Our brains have the capacity to change. And in fact, we can train our brains to change. Next slide. So Dan Siegel discusses in this book this theory from neuropsychology, namely, what fires together in the brain wires together. That is to say that if I'm used to being stressed out, that will be the firing that goes on in my brain, and soon enough I've created pretty steady neuronal pathways in my brain where I'll be operating in a constant stressful state of mind. One client of mine years ago referred to it this way. She talked about barbecuing in her own adrenaline, which would be a very poignant image of what it's like to be operating in constant stress enough so that your adrenaline level is constantly turned on. And so it's possible for our brains to get wired that way. The great thing about neuroplasticity is that we can unwire, or maybe I should say rewire our brains. Next slide. We can actually build new neuronal pathways in our brain. And mindfulness practice is one of the most effective ways for doing that. Next slide. Dr. Siegel summarizes this research as well in his book, is that there's plenty of research at this point to suggest that we can actually, through mindfulness practice, build brain. Technically, it's referred to as the thickening of the cerebral cortex. That same frontal cortex that is the center of the executive system, not only can we have it begin to fire differently, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, we can actually get it to wire differently, enough so that it actually builds new tissue, which is amazing to imagine. The process is this, is that mindfulness meditation moves us into our executive network, and let me discuss how that happens. In fact, if you think about this meditation we just did, if you're like me, most of us have a difficult time paying attention for very long to something as simple as the breath. I'm taken by thoughts, as I mentioned earlier, memories of the past, worries about the future. I'm taken by those and kind of always in motion with that. In the meditative traditions from Asia, for example, they refer to this phenomenon as monkey mind. Monkey mind is simply a monkey swinging from one branch to the next, and you can see the analogy. It's so oftentimes the way it goes with our attention. And what mindfulness does is it corrals all of that, including my vigilance to potential negative stimuli, things to worry about in the outer or worry about in the inner, and actually begins to silence or quiet them in a way that's very useful for countering stress. There's also the idea that the frontal cortex, there are fibers that reach from the frontal cortex down into the emotional centers of the brain that actually are mediated by what's referred to as GABA. It's a neurotransmitter, and it's calming. And so it's as if I had one supervisor who herself is a student of Dan Siegel, Bonnie Badenoch, who used to talk to me about this, how it is those soothing GABA fibers that go from the frontal cortex down to the limbic system, that we can actually build more and more of those neuronal pathways so that we can actually develop, in a sense, a new default, which is being able to move into a steady state of more consistent calm. And mindfulness is one means of developing that. If you think about what it's like to build new muscles, let's say that you're wanting to build your abdominal muscles by doing sit-ups. You don't start off doing a lot of them, or you end up racked in pain. I still remember that from childhood. It's just like I was going to do a bunch of sit-ups and not being able to walk the next day. You start gradually, but you build up a capacity, and soon enough you begin to build up structure in your midsection. It was the exact same thing with the brain. Most of us aren't really good at what we just did, that is to be mindful, but that we can actually build that. I like what one author talks about in the mindfulness literature. If you can imagine railroad cars connected and going by quickly, if you've ever stood next to a train and watched it go by, what we're talking about is slowing down the cars in such a way that we start noticing the gaps between the cars. They're not solid, there's gaps between them. And then the idea with mindfulness is you begin to extend the gaps between the cars. And so there's more and more spaciousness between our internal world and those stimuli, as well as our external world and its stimuli. There's more and more spaces where we can observe rather than get caught in them. And so there's a direct correlation, as you might imagine, with increased mindfulness and reduced anxiety. So, again, if stress is the number one trigger for relapse, next slide, please. If stress is the number one trigger for relapse, next slide. The great thing is I can now do something to retrain my brain. I want to review in just a moment where we were last week when we talked about the brain. We were talking specifically about PAWS, about post-acute withdrawal syndrome. But before I do that, I want to take just a moment to check in with my co-producers to see if we have any comments or questions from our audience. We'll address those, and we'll come back and talk about brain changes more specifically that are a function of practicing mindfulness. Thank you. So we have a comment here. Angela, welcome back to you, Angela. It's good to have you with us. She asks, is there a device we can use at home to monitor our body to see if we are succeeding in changing from the stress mode? I'm glad you asked that, Angela. As you know, Angela, I was just up in Palo Alto in the last month, back at the beginning of October, I believe, tail end of November, of September. It's what referred to as the Transformational Technology Conference. And there were any number of devices that were being displayed there, and I tried on several of them, ways of monitoring our stress levels, and they're quite sensitive. I'll tell you a story, Angela, and this is to all of us. My first exposure to being able to monitor brain waves goes back almost 40 years ago. My first year in graduate school, I volunteered as a subject for an experiment by one of my upper classmates, and it was with biofeedback. So I was exposed for the first time to biofeedback, and they basically put some monitors on my fingers, as I recall, hooked it up to a fancy box, and the box would register my EEG. It would register the level of my brain activation. And what was amazing to me to learn is that it was just, and it was manifest as an auditory tone. So let's say it's like, ooh, like this, a certain level of brain activity, is that I very quickly learned how to lower it because the feedback was so immediate. So I realized that for me, for example, this is probably the very beginnings of my beginning to focus on the breath, as I took my mind out of thoughts and began to focus on something like my breath, or it could be a mantra, for example. The sound would go, woo, like this. And I did it a half hour once a week for, I think it was a whole semester. And at the end of the week, at the end of the semester, it got down to where it was, the sound was very deep. And so, and I could fiddle with it. I could think of something that was anxiety producing and it'd go, like this again, back and forth. So there's various ways that this is monitored through biofeedback. And I think most of the devices that I saw at this Transformational Technology Conference were a variation on the theme of biofeedback. Certainly in 40 years it's gotten more sophisticated. It's also gotten more affordable. So when I got back from Palo Alto, I went online and I ordered a little biofeedback device, and I actually have it at home, and I use it in the mornings when I meditate right now. I'm just interested to see how it's going in terms of tracking this shift. One way to talk about this is that when I'm in the default mode network, which is of hypervigilance or more relative activity, let's say, for example, I'm worrying, it is immediately detectable through the biofeedback device. I won't go into the mechanics of how it's recording, other than to suggest that it's very sensitive to stress. No, I will go into the mechanics. The device I have is actually measuring what's called the galvanic skin response. It's incredible to me, Angela, that our bodies will register immediately in terms of increased moisture or sweat, the kicking in of a stress response. If you think about it, stress has a lot of bodily changes, increased heartbeat for one, and pupillary constriction for another, or is it dilation? It must be dilation. But another one is the sweat response, or the increased skin moisture. And so I hooked myself up to this GSR, biofeedback, galvanic skin response, and I can literally practice moving from, in our language here today, I can practice moving from the default mode network into the executive network, and I get feedback immediately. The current device I have, actually, it's amazing. First of all, it's very affordable. I think I paid all of $80 for this. And in the days 40 years ago when I did this experiment with biofeedback, it was easily several $100s, the contraption that I was hooked up to. And this one today hooks up to my smartphone, and it actually renders the brain waves right there in front of me. It's really crazy. And so I can be meditating, listening to meditative music, for example, in my room, meditating with the sensors on my fingers, and watch the waves descend and absolutely control that. And it gives you a readout at the end of your meditation session. And that's all for $80. That's pretty amazing. So there are monitors like that. If you're interested, you could write me and I can give you the specific name of this one. I do not work for this company. I just found the one that had the best reputation for the least money. But I think there are all variations on this for sure. So I'm very much into that, and I'll tell you why. I'm less interested in measuring and recording for all time my brain waves than I am in being able to enhance my concentration by actually getting moment-to-moment feedback. You recall that John Kabat-Zinn said that mindfulness is learning how to be in the present moment. Well, here's a means of really monitoring that. And the feedback is instantaneous, and you can begin to adjust it. Who would have thought that we can lower our blood pressure by developing this kind of technique that we're talking about? And in fact, we can. You can actually learn to develop skills that you weren't aware of just by practicing. So I'm glad you mentioned that. It's a great question, and highly recommend that as an adjunct to mindfulness practice. Any other comments or questions, co-producers? Brother Austin? Okay, thank you. Okay, well, then let's pick back up with the next slide. Thank you, Franz. You'll recognize this if you viewed last week's presentation. We were talking about addiction in the brain and what happens in relationships early in recovery. And we talked about three changes that summarize a good bit of the research that's been done on the addictive brain, and I would also say the brain in early recovery. These three changes simply are: we have a numbed pleasure response. Things that used to give us pleasure no longer do. We referred to that last week with the technical term anhedonia. It'd be a not hedonic, or not hedonism, or not pleasure. So we have a numbed pleasure response. Secondly, we have increased craving. As we talked about last week, I can stop as an addict. I can stop using for a day or two or three, but what I can't do is I can't stop craving. And we talked about this in terms of the dopamine system last week, the increased craving that gets tied into cues in the environment as well as cues inside. And then thirdly, the third brain change is decreased impulse control. We have less and less capacity to control our aggression, for example. We talked about irritability and anger manifest in relationships. So, next slide. So I want you to think for just a moment of how it is that mindful awareness might have an impact on my ability to experience pleasure, my being able to intervene against craving? And how might it address or inform my ability to control my impulses? Mindful awareness. To think about that for a second. Next slide. If we use Jon Kabat-Zinn's definition of mindfulness, which is to pay attention, let's just look at that one for just a second. How might that apply to my capacity to experience pleasure? Now, early on, honestly, the brain has a hard time of registering pleasure when we're coming out of addiction. But if I can begin to quiet my mind from its hyperactivated state. We talked about that numbed pleasure response is owing to the fact that there's an increase in stress hormones in the brain to compensate for the substance around the drug addiction, is that with that increased cortisol, if I can learn voluntarily to control that cortisol response, and we're saying that you can with mindfulness, that it stands to reason that I might be able to open up the aperture in terms of experiencing pleasure again where I once did, but have been dislocated from that owing to addiction or early recovery. That we're paying attention on purpose, we're doing this setting aside time, that we're focusing in the present moment, and we're doing that without judgment. Let's look at the next slide. We've already talked about this. Mindfulness can add to more pleasure by my being aware. I was thinking of it this week as I was preparing for today's presentation. My first experience of going to a mindfulness conference was back about 1981, and it was with Jack Kornfield, who's a mindfulness instructor, has quite a reputation. He was a much younger man than I was too. And I spent a weekend with him meditating and learning mindfulness. And I remember one of the exercises very early on that Dr. Kornfeld had us do. He handed around a bowl that had raisins in it, and each of us was instructed to take a raisin. And I grew up in the Central Valley near Fresno, which is considered the world's capital for raisins. I've eaten a lot of raisins in my life. Okay, so here we were taking one raisin. I thought, okay. And by this point, we had been introduced to mindfulness theoretically, and we'd also been introduced with a little bit of practice. And he asked us to put the raisin in our mouth and close our eyes and do some version of what we just did earlier. What do you imagine happened? Universally, the response in the group, because we did share, we spent like 20 minutes. By the way, you're instructed not to chew the raisin. Just let it sit there. And let the saliva begin to kind of digest and open it up. At some point, we were relieved by being able to chew it and then notice the taste of it. But we slowed down. Think of that, 20 minutes to eat one raisin. This is a new diet. The experience was so intense, it's unforgettable to me. How can a raisin taste that big? That's really the sense of it. And it was universal in the room. We were all just kind of stunned by that. So when we talk about enhancing pleasure, if we're able to slow down those railroad cars and start noticing the gaps between them, if we're able to slow down eating that raisin to where it takes 20 minutes, you can bet your bottom dollar that it's going to open up the possibility of experiencing pleasure. And imagine this, you guys, is that we can actually practice this like we would building any muscle, that you can actually practice the muscles that go into experiencing pleasure. Reminds me of the work that Masters and Johnson did in the early days of behavior sex therapy, where they had what they referred to as sensate focus. Couples would come in with sexual dysfunction, and he would have them, Masters and Johnson, would have the couples hold each other, even look at each other in the eyes for lengthy periods of time, 20 minutes on a single raisin, to where and to do so without any intent or moving towards overt sexuality. So just be in the presence of sensations and focusing on nothing but sensations in the present moment, with no intent to move beyond that into sexuality. And the goal was very similar. It was like to open up pleasure around proximity, around contact with your partner without any expectation, and all that goes with that led to the sexual dysfunction. And this was instrumental to cure in terms of a lot of the sexual dysfunction that Masters and Johnson treated. So in the similar spirit, that's what we're talking about, opening up the pleasure response with mindfulness. Secondly, reducing of craving. I just reviewed some material this week. There was an excellent YouTube lecture on this topic of how it is that Craving leads me to the third item, which is the impulse to act upon the craving. What happens if we slow down those railroad cars? In other words, what would happen if we meditated just on the craving? That is, interrupt for just a moment what craving compels us to do, whatever the action is. In the context of addiction, it would be for us to reach for the addictive substance or engage in the addictive behavior. What would it be to interrupt that by stopping and slowing down and doing just exactly what we just did in terms of focusing on my breath? Maybe with no expectation of anything other than just noticing what it feels like to crave. What would it be like to slow down the railroad cars of craving and begin to notice the contours, the gaps between the cars? And this particular presentation that I viewed, this is exactly the point of the author, is that we can actually begin to modify the intensity of the cravings by observing them. If you think about it, it's like this. If I'm identified with anything, including a craving, if I'm welded together like this, there's no space, there's really not much wiggle room there. But if I can find some way, technically, to disidentify with the craving, step back one step, let's say, then it's no longer identification with the craving, it's actually observation of the craving. And I know plenty of this from psychology. If I can help a client to disidentify with their anger and rather observe it, disidentify with any impulse just for the sake of observing it, that's half the battle won. This was the goal of Carl Jung, and the analysis that he developed was to help clients identify rather than be identified with their various psychological complexes. So whatever issues were troubling them, he would help provide through empathically attuned therapy, help them to identify where they were getting caught. And in that identifying of it, in that naming of the lay of the land, they were all already distancing from being overtaken or overwhelmed by the complex. Same idea here. So what would it be like to observe craving? I know it sounds completely counterintuitive. Why would I want to focus in meditation on my craving? But I ask you, why not? Why not try that as an experiment? Why not try it? What do you have to lose? The craving is very predictable. What would it be like to step back and observe it just by focusing on your breath? And as the craving comes up, do what we did with thoughts. Okay, craving. Now let's set it on the shelf and let's go back to the breath. Sure enough, craving's going to come off the shelf. Okay, patiently, let's put it back on the shelf. Okay, so that we can actually build muscles to contain the craving and lessen it. And then thirdly, in terms of impulse control, you can well imagine where this goes. If rather than acting on an impulse, I'm actually able to focus in on something like mindfulness of the breath to interrupt the impulse to act. I've done this as an experiment again and again over the last many years, including in my own recovery, is that it's amazing to me. I remember my mom used to say this. I don't think I appreciated the advice when I was younger. She'd say, why not just count to 10 before you react, Bob? I tend to react quickly, and I think that was her comment to me. But the wisdom in that is that if I can interrupt that impulse circuitry by introducing something like just focusing on my breath, in fact, she used to say, why don't you just take 2 deep breaths? I think my mom taught me to meditate, come to think of it. I wasn't a very good student when I was younger. I still can sometimes not be a good student, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But the idea that I could introduce an interruption in my normal kind of reflexive impulses by just stopping and reflecting on it, reflecting on my breath and setting them on the shelf actually begins to give me more cognitive control. We're really talking about building up that executive network, aren't we? The idea that our impulses, our emotional reactions are centered in the center of the brain, that default mode network need not run amok. We can actually begin to develop muscles of our frontal cortex. We can actually build cerebral cortex. We talked about that. We can build brain through mindfulness. These are all ways that we can change the brain in a positive way. I mentioned a minute ago that I'm not always the best student. The fact of the matter is that default mode network is pretty doggone persistent. And it's insidious. And so I've meditated more on than off for the last almost 40 years now. But I notice I say more on than off, which means there's been a lot of off times. And so it takes, first of all, it takes practice for it to become habitual. And secondly, you're always going upstream against the default mode network. And we naturally will default towards the negative end of things, towards the vigilance, towards the anxiety. And so Carl Jung called this the opus contra naturam, the work against nature. You're basically going upstream. That's why they call it the default mode network. You're going upstream to build executive function. So it takes discipline, it takes habit, and it takes commitment. But let me tell you of the benefits of that as we wind down today. Next slide. Actually, the next slide, actually. There we go, thank you. In committed recovery, the rich get richer. The next slide. We introduced this last week, is there's an adaptive spiral. And what I mean by that is that as I practice mindfulness, there's a reduction in my stress level. There's an enhancement of my protecting my sobriety, my recovery, and I get to benefit both in terms of sustaining successful sobriety, which itself is a positive boost for my self-esteem, but I'm also developing skills where I'm getting better and better gradually over time. Early on, it can be quite significant as you begin to notice adding this to your daily discipline, your daily practice. But I'm beginning to build a kind of resilience against stress. And I can say this for myself, is that I'll just use today as an example. I came from leading a group shortly before our meeting today. I got here a little bit early. I sat down in the opening down below in this beautiful building that we share. In fact, I saw Austin walk by as I was sitting there, and basically what I was doing was taking 5 minutes just to breathe, just 5 minutes just to kind of settle. It's become more and more reflexive for me. When I'm in a stressful situation, I can be in a meeting where I'm going to present in 5 minutes and be nervous about that, and I will just almost habitually drop into what we just did. I'll just go into breathing. No one knows I'm doing that. It looks like I'm just sitting there breathing. And that's exactly what I'm doing. The only difference is I'm really noticing that I'm breathing. Just like that. Okay. So that's today's presentation. Is I want to encourage, we've talked in the past about gratitude. We've talked about practicing gratitudes as a way to reduce stress. We've also talked about forgiveness practice in terms of developing the capacity to build muscles of self-compassion, which itself is also an insurance of our recovery. And today we've introduced mindfulness. I think all of these wind together. I will say this much in my own mindfulness practice over the last number of years, including in my recovery, is that everything that we've talked about in terms of gratitudes, forgiveness practice, and today mindfulness of the breath and of the body, these are part of the practice that I do in mindfulness, and I can do all of this in about 20 minutes. It's about 20 minutes that I practice. Now I've got myself hooked up to biofeedback as I'm doing it. But it gets to be where it's just habitual, like anything else that you do. You get up in the morning, you brush your teeth. You get up in the morning and you take 20 minutes for quiet time. I really recommend starting this, if you're interested in mindfulness practice, I recommend starting your day with it. Rather, for me, the way it goes is this. I like setting the tone. I like laying claim to the day myself before the day lays claim to me. And so if I can start the day by creating a kind of a calm inner space, it doesn't just last for those 20 minutes. It actually radiates into the day. One of the good things about building brain through mindfulness practice is that you find that it will generalize to more and more of your life. And so I start my day with that. I don't end my day with that, or if I do, it puts me to sleep. I do wake up at night. My daughter Amanda gave birth to her daughter, my granddaughter, yesterday morning, Emma Jane. And the night before Emma Jane came into the world, I was awake all night long. And what I did through the night, I realized there's nothing I'm going to be able to do to calm down dad/granddad. It's just too much in my body to be on alert for my daughter. But what I can do is I can be kind to myself. And so I lay in bed and I practice what we talked about. I'll just practice breathing at night. Oftentimes if I wake up, most often, I can put myself back to sleep by mindfulness practice. It just reroutes me from the default mode network. That's what wakes us up at night, is the default mode network kicks in. You've got adrenaline going through your body. You can't possibly sleep with adrenaline coursing through your veins. And here's a way of reversing that. And so I do practice it at night, and you might find that useful as well. Many individuals who are early in recovery from various addictions to substances will experience this rebound effect and will have horrible insomnia. Here's something, a direct intervention, a non-medicinal intervention that's very potent and powerful. I do recommend that you start the morning with this, and I recommend that you start doing nothing more than what we did. Take 5 minutes. Start small and build up. I told you that I went to a workshop where I meditated for 6-8 hours a day for 2 or 3 days. I've done that a few times. You can build up to that if you desire to do that. That's a very powerful practice for sure. But I'm not suggesting you do that. I'm suggesting, in fact, if you only have 5 minutes, that's 5 minutes well spent in terms of stress reduction. And so I recommend starting small and building that up. The resources I've given you, the book by Stan Block, the book by Dan Siegel, the book by John Kabat-Zinn, those are all good places to start for sure. And you're welcome to reference this podcast. It'll be archived on Ask an Addiction Specialist. You can review this and you can actually do the practice as I led you today. This is very close to the practice that I bring to the individuals I'm working with in treatment right now. It's quick, it's very accessible, it makes sense, and it yields quick results. Which isn't to say that you might not have experienced a lot of calming. My doctoral dissertation was on mindfulness. I did it 35 years ago. It was one of the early studies in mindfulness. And what I found in my study was that early meditators oftentimes become very aware of how active their monkeys are in their brains, that the monkeys are swinging from vine to vine. And so that may well have been your experience today. I would say consider that a success, because just having an awareness of the monkey swinging from branch to branch is, as I mentioned earlier, is half the battle won. It's like, wow, okay, now what can I do about that? Well, what you can do about that is continue to practice mindfulness, because the monkey will slow down and fewer monkeys will be swinging soon enough. And so you will get results with that. One last piece is I recommend, if you find this useful as a practice, bringing it through your day in the same spirit as I said. When I came here today, I sat for 5 minutes and just practiced mindfulness. When I'm in a meeting and I want to calm myself down, if I'm in the middle of the night, get to where you can practice a minute here or a minute there, and it becomes much more kind of insinuated into your life. You really are building new neuronal pathways, and they'll become more and more hardwired in for you. I've noticed this. I have a very hyper mind. If you haven't guessed, I have a very hyper mind. Always have. But what's striking to me is that typically I feel a fair bit of peace inside. I can get thrown off. I can become anxious, or I can become hostile, or whatever. But that's the exception. And what I've discovered, I believe, is that you can cultivate, even if you're hyper like I am, a fairly steady state of calm inside. I'll be drumming in a couple of weeks again here locally. I play jazz drums in a quintet of mine. And when I'm drumming, there's a lot of activity going on. But inside of that, there's actually a fair bit of mindfulness. I feel very calm inside, even as all 4 limbs are playing. And I use that as a kind of a rough analogy. You can be very active. I used to run regularly. I ran several miles a day for years. And I'd be completely calm inside as I was doing that. And it was really, I was focusing on the breath. I was actually practicing mindfulness as I ran. I now do that when I drum. And you can do that too in your day-to-day life. So I recommend that. You can wash dishes mindfully. You can eat raisins mindfully. You can be loving towards your partner, towards your family, and just be mindful. Stay mindful of yourself. I like how the contemporary spiritual author Eckhart Tolle puts it. He says, give 90% of your attention to the task at hand, or the conversation, let's say, but keep 10% for yourself. And what he's talking about there is slowing down the railroad cars and just noticing how you're doing. It's one of the most effective ways of managing your own anxiety, is to be aware of it. It's also one of the best tools for managing anger. If you're quick to anger, is just scanning all the time, 10%, scanning your body, so that you catch anger before it does what I call going over the falls. If you can catch it far enough upstream, you can actually do something to divert it. If it gets too far down the line, it's going to go over the edge, and we've all experienced that. So mindfulness can be very useful that way too. I hope I've established strong rationale for why you might consider this in recovery practice. And if you yourself are not actively in recovery, I suggest that you practice it with your partner who is, because I think it can be a shared practice as well. There's a lot of power. I meet with a group here locally every Friday, and we meditate together. All of us are in recovery together. It's Refuge Recovery, meets here locally. And there's tremendous power in that meeting of meditating together every Friday, and we've done this now for a few years. There's a lot of power in the collective mindfulness as well. So I recommend that you try that as an experiment too. Thank you for your attention today. Let me tell you that next week we'll be looking at addiction, shame and recovery. We'll be going a deep dive into shame next week. We'll probably have a couple of weeks running on addressing shame, and then we'll be looking shortly after that to revisit mindfulness with Scott Killaby. I want to thank you for your attention today. I want to recommend that you go to Ask an Addiction Specialist on Facebook. You can review an archive of all of our videos. I hope that you'll like us. Okay. And stay tuned for next week. Last final slide. Implied in all of this, implied in neuroplasticity, is that there's hope for changing our minds, changing our brains, changing our lives. And if you want further resources, in addition to Ask an Addiction Specialist, please go to my website. My website is solely devoted to resources for supporting recovery. A lot of resources on mindfulness there, videos as well as blog posts, and I highly recommend that you access that too. Stay tuned. I'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us today on Ask an Addiction Specialist. Take care.